Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thank you for watching Enquiry. As India starts emerging from its lockdowns, the full scale of the economic crisis facing the country becomes more apparent. Over the last 50 days, we've seen a terrible and tragic exodus of millions of India's workforce trying to reach home. Now, some other stark figures are emerging. India was already at a 40-year high of unemployment. Now, according to the Azim Premji University, 8 out of 10 urban Indians have lost their jobs during lockdown. 90% of India's farmers have not received full price for their produce. And according to Goldman Sachs, India is looking at a 5% drop in its GDP. Sectors across the spectrum are reeling with shock. The Modi government has responded with a 20 lakh crore relief and stimuli package. Yet analysts say only about 1.7 lakh crore will actually flow out from the government, and this amounts to around 0.75 or 1% of India's GDP. So is the relief and stimuli package enough to mitigate the crisis? Were there other alternate actions? To discuss these issues, I'm delighted to introduce our guest at Enquiry today, Mr. P Chidambaram, former finance minister of the country and a senior leader of the Congress party. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Chidambaram.
Morning.
Mr. Chidambaram, what I'd like to start with is the immediate issue of whether out of the 20 lakh crore that has been announced, is there enough to create relief and mitigation of the immediate crisis? You've been calling for remonetizing the poor, protecting the salary and wages of people. Does this address those questions?
Most certainly not. I'm glad that I'm not alone. Most analysts place the size of the fiscal stimulus package between 0.8% to a generous 1.5%. According to me, it's about 0.91%. The 20 lakh crore is an inflated, hyperbolic amount. It doesn't address my demands for putting cash in the hands of the poor families, cash in the hands of the migrants, a wage assistance program for MSMEs, and a wage protection program for the low salaried employees.
So what explains this reluctance on the part of the government? You know, this is the first time where across the board, economists of every denomination, whether it's the IMF or World Bank or political parties across the spectrum, everyone has given carte blanche to the government to spend, to even print money if necessary. If you were to put yourself in their shoes for a moment, what explains their reluctance to do this?
This government is a prisoner of its own ignorance and fears. Besides, neither Prime Minister Modi nor the Finance Minister have any experience of macroeconomic management. The Prime Minister has been Chief Minister for long. The Finance Minister is completely new to the job. I think they are poor advisors, and whatever advice they get, they are afraid to accept and they reject it.
I wanted to ask you that Nirmala Sitharaman has, criticized you for your handling of the 2008 crisis. She said that your spending at that point triggered the NPAs. There was careless lending. You did not stop that on time, which led to 10% food inflation, and that the entire playbook of 2008 under your leadership is an example for her of what not to do. How would you react to that criticism?
She has amnesia. I left the finance ministry on December 1, 2008. The 2008 crisis hit the world and hit India in September 15.
Well, she hasn't specifically mentioned you, but she mentions the UPA, so...
Just now said, under your leadership, you said?
Yes, well...
Amnesia. She should ask this question to Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, who handled the portfolio all through 2009, 2010 and 2011. As his colleague, I'm not criticizing him. I take collective responsibility. But her government gave Mr. Pranab Mukherjee Bharat Ratna also. So she should ask him whether he had done anything which ought not to have been done. And he will answer her.
But
it is, even at that time, it was pointed out that while the first stimulus package was absolutely necessary, which I had crafted and then left The second stimulus package was perhaps necessary, which Dr. Manmohan Singh has crafted. The third stimulus package was perhaps unnecessary. And once the inflation went out of control, we should have pulled back very quickly. But Ms. Sitharaman should know, when I returned to the finance ministry in 2012, the first thing I did was to pull back. We reduced the fiscal deficit sharply in a matter of 18 months. We drastically reduced the current account deficit. And when we left government, according to their own economic survey, India was growing at 6.3% or so before they revised it. Therefore, I don't blame her for an amnesia. She's new to the job.
Cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
So she has used this metaphor when repeatedly defending her policy for not putting money in people's hands. She's used the kind of proverb that if you give someone fish, then it's just the hunger is sorted in the short term. But if you teach them fishing, then it's for a lifetime. And so she says this is the philosophy of the Jansang, and they would rather, teach people how to be entrepreneurs, open up the economy, rather than put money in people's hands. What would be your response to that?
What did they do in the 3 financial years before Corona? Why did they not teach fishing to the people, or were they teaching fishing to the people? And in 7 successive quarters, the GDP declined. We declined from 8% to 4.5%, and we were still fishing for the bottom when the Corona hit us. The Corona actually saved this government from acute economic embarrassment. Now everybody thinks that the economic downslide is because of Corona. Please understand what the governor of the Reserve Bank said, Shaktikanta Das. We had a slowdown. The lockdown is upon the slowdown.
So, the Mr. Hardeep Puri, for instance, has just written that the opposition is really crying wolf. They keep changing the goalpost. Putting money into people's hands is not the only way, that stimuli is important as well. What would be your response to that?
But whoever says that there are other ways to put money in the hands of the people must tell us how much money has been actually put in the hands of the people. The fact is, very little money is being put in the hands of the people this year, over and above, underline, over and above the budgeted expenditure of rupees 30 lakh 42,230 crore. Now, what the gentleman forgets is, it is not as though India's economy was roaring at 7 or 8%. There is a coronavirus hit us, and therefore we need to put money. We were already in a declining graph for 7 successive quarters. We had touched a bottom of 4.5%, and I don't think the bottom had been touched yet. There's a declining graph. If you don't put more money than what is budgeted in the February budget, you are bound to face a recession. In fact, everybody today has said the recession will be as much as 5%, minus 5%.
So, if we come back to the relief and stimuli package, one of the things that the government has linked even state borrowing to is reforms, and it's not yet specified what those reforms for ease of doing business is. But the one that has got some headlines is the labor reforms that the UP and MP government pushed through. Do you think that those were wise moves? The fact that they removed all civil rights of workers and said that this was the way to woo industry. Again, I'll remind ourselves that labor reform has been on the hot plate of every government, including yours. Is this what governments wanted? Is this the only way to woo industry?
See, our labor laws go back about 60 to 80 years. There have been piecemeal amendments from time to time. So it's perhaps right to say, let's sit down and work out a comprehensive labor code. But is this the time to do it? When workers have been laid off, retrenched, the unorganized sector has become visible to everybody today. Is this the time to talk about labor reforms? It's adding insult to injury. And doing it by an ordinance on a concurrent list subject without the concurrence of the central government. Therefore, whatever UP, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat did is not yet law. It cannot be law unless the central government gives its concurrence, and it hasn't. And the UP government has withdrawn one order already. So I think this is a very clumsy effort to push through reforms which perhaps are desirable in the view of one person. But that has to be done through a consultation with stakeholders and under normal circumstances when Parliament is functioning. How can you do all this when trade unions are at their weakest point? I think it's completely wrong. It has to be rejected out of hand. We have to go back to status quo ante and then say when normalcy returns, we will come back to the subject.
But Mr. Chidambaram, let me just press you a little bit on that point, that when you're saying that maybe in peacetime these reforms were desirable, these reforms included taking away all the safety nets of the working class. It's not just about removing an inspection Raj. It meant you can work 12-hour days without overtime, that there will be no minimum wages, there will be no sanitation, there will be no canteens, there will be no creches, there's no medical insurance. You can't approach the courts. Are these reforms, and are these what will bring industry and investment? Are you saying that these are what is necessary even in peacetime?
Certainly not. These are not reforms. I didn't mention any one of the items you mentioned. I said labor laws have to be reformed and reassessed. But I didn't say that these minimal protections should be taken away. See, by the way, these minimal protections apply today only to India's 10% of India's workforce. 90% of India's workforce do not have these protections. So when a labor code is drawn up, it should cover both the organized sector and the unorganized sector. See, I have one reason to be confident. Ultimately, even an ordinance passed by the state government and concurred in by the central government has to pass in a legislature or parliament. None of this will pass. You can take it from me, none of this will pass even in a BJP-dominated Lok Sabha or a BJP-dominated legislature.
So, what would be your recommendation for what should have happened right now? If you just look at the migrant crisis, that is something that's exploding in our faces. And we keep speaking of them as migrants, but they're really the workforce of this country. They comprise almost 80-85% in various sectors. Do you think the government says that it's done enough, that it's put out almost 6 lakh crore to mitigate the migrants' distress? Would you run through that? What do you think has been adequate and what is lacking?
Rubbish. The numbers don't add up to more than a few thousand crore. The definite, direct, specific number is 3,500 crore, which will be given for the migrant workers not covered under the National Food Security Scheme at the rate of 5 kilo of grain for 2 months. Nothing more has been given to the migrant. The migrant is walking even today. The trains have transported about 10 lakh migrants, 1 million migrants. But something like 1 crore migrants, 10 million migrants have walked their way. Now, what do they get when they reach their home state? They are screened, they are tested, they are quarantined and sent home with nothing in their hand. I have a simple solution. As they step out of the quarantine and go back to their villages, give each migrant 5,000 rupees. Even if 1 crore migrants are given 5,000 rupees, it will cost you 5,000 crore rupees. If it's 2 crore migrant families who are going back to their villages, it will be 10,000 crore rupees. These are simple solutions, but like in everything else in life, the simplest solution escapes the most learned people.
Yeah, well, it's, some of it is a bit surprising because the response the government has to the criticisms people like you and other economists are raising is to say that we are obfuscating the point that many of these migrant workers are involved with MSMEs, or that, through the Narega, they're going to get an additional 40,000 crore, so many more man job days. The wages have been increased, and that these are more self-reliant ways than merely putting money into people's hands. What would be your riposte to that?
If the migrant worker was in the MSME, he would not have migrated. He would not have walked back. the question of putting money in his hands doesn't arise. He has left the MSME, he has left the unorganized business, he's left the construction site, he has left the bridge under which he was sleeping, and he's gone back. He's in his home state now, being tested and quarantined. He's without money. He is completely without cash. His family is without money. You have to put monies in his hands, and you don't do that. That's because we don't treat our migrant workers as humans. That is the problem.
But Mr. Chidambaram, this plight of the migrant workers that is now so much in focus, even journalists say, oh, this is an invisible people that we were not aware of. Why were they invisible? They are 80 or 90% of India's population, but by and large, policy has left them out as well. So why were previous governments blind to them? That's a question that would definitely come your way.
This should be put to all political parties who run states. The migrant worker, as long as he's working in a host state, is a responsibility of that state government. His housing, his income, his statutory protection, if any, his social security, is a responsibility of state governments. The state governments have abandoned them. The central government has abandoned them. This is my complaint. And what is the point of talking about the past now? All of us bear the cross for the past. We have to deal with the present and find a way to mitigate the suffering and hardship and destitution for the migrant workers returned home.
So I won't press on that point because there are many urgent issues here, but just relatedly, I'd like to ask you one other question, which is that the irony is that today all of the possible humanitarian delivery is through structures that, like the Narega, through the food security program. Many of those were really set up on the advice of the much reviled NAC that worked with Sonia Gandhi. The journalists used to revile them, opposition parties reviled them, even within Congress. There was a lot of division over the welfare program that was advised by the NAC. Speaking for yourself, sir, would you say that you revise your own views on the importance of the welfare state?
I don't understand the question. I was a finance minister who introduced Maganrega. I was a finance minister who introduced the national food security. During the course of deliberations, we may have tried to fine-tune it this way or that way. But ultimately, I was a finance minister who announced these two programs. The reason is most people who are in the administration, most people who write about them are highly elitist. They come from a different class, and I'm sorry, they come from a different caste.
But just in terms of, again, the cash mitigation, speaking responsibly right now, that if you were in the finance minister's chair, what is it that you would do? Some people are saying that maybe the government doesn't have the fiscal space. It's fine for everyone to be advising from outside. So whatever advice you're giving, if you were the finance minister right now, would you actually follow through on that?
I would follow through. Please remember, I would be finance minister, I doubt it, in a Congress government or in a left of center government. Now, we start with the 30 lakh crore. See, this budget is completely outdated, it's irrelevant. All that we know is we can start with 30 lakh crore, give or take 4 or 5 lakh crore of shortfall in revenues. So let's start with 25 lakh crore rupees that are available to us in terms of tax revenue, non-tax revenue, capital receipts and proceeds of disinvestment. To that, I would add another 15 lakh crore to make it a 40 lakh crore budget, and I will present a completely new budget. There are many current programs that have an axe saying these are to be sacrificed for the sake of coronavirus battle. I have a 40 lakh crore budget. I have already earned through the excise on petrol and diesel and the freezing of DA and DR, they've already earned about 2 lakh crore. I'll borrow another 10 to 12 lakh crore and make it a 40 lakh crore budget, and I'll present a completely new budget. See, for example, is it necessary to spend money on space exploration this year? The space will be there next year. Is it necessary to put a satellite in space this year? We can put that satellite next year. Therefore, there are I'm giving examples. The central,
or 20,000 crore of Central Vista.
the bullet train, the Prime Minister's museum. Are all these things necessary now? So actually, if you sit with the expenditure secretary and go line by line, I have found from experience, it's a huge opportunity to cut out completely irrelevant programs. So I would present a 40 lakh crore budget with a completely revised expenditure profile.
You've just said about reallocating budgets, maybe borrowing about 10 lakh crore. But there are other economists who've even said that, I just spoke to Mr. Yashwant Sinha, he said print money if necessary, and even that can be managed. Would you agree with that? And would you, as finance minister, have felt the need to print money? How would you have managed the fallout of that?
I would support printing money. We have not had an opportunity or a need to print money after RBI and the government signed that agreement to abolish treasury bills. But that option is always there. It is the last weapon in the hands of the sovereign. Other sovereigns have done that. In the 2008 crisis, every country, every central bank agreed and printed money. We didn't have to go through that pain. If necessary, we'll have to print money. Even the most conservative central banker I know, Dr. Rangarajan, for whom I have the greatest respect, supports printing money. If a part of the excess fiscal deficit has to be monetized, so be it. Let's monetize it.
So, sir, what can explain, like I said earlier, that there is a carte blanche to this government to spend. For any government, that's a political bonzana. What could, politically, I'm asking, stop it from spending? What can possibly be the logic?
Well, that question has to be put to their spokesman, if any one of them is willing to come on your program and answer the question. But I can only say they are completely misled and misdirected. They think they can ride out this crisis. See, demonetization was a monumental blunder. The GST was botched up. It brought a bad name to the GST and disrupted trade. Nevertheless, they got re-elected in 2019. The next election is 4 years away. Perhaps they are smug in the comfort that, well, elections are 4 years away. The virus crisis will pass in a year or two. We would still have 2 years to revive the economy. Maybe that's the smugness that has crept into them. And I don't know. I'm speculating. I can't put myself in their shoes and think like them because I'm not them.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a reliance on the fact. In fact, this article I was referring to by Mr. Puri, he reiterates that, this is opposition parties that barely can make 10% seats. So, this is just pointless criticism. There is a reliance on the fact that the opposition in this country has really fallen to smithereens. It barely exists. So maybe that's my speculation on it.
Mr. Puri is completely wrong. Mr. Puri must remember that many of the bigger states of India are today governed by non-BJP parties. Don't write off the opposition parties, number one. Number two, the Congress party alone got 19% of the vote last time. That's not 10%. A shift of about 10% vote will completely change the political landscape of India. And 10% vote shifts have taken place in the past.
Yeah, of course, that opens Congress to the jibe of losing Madhya Pradesh after acquiring one of the largest states, but those are conversations for another time. So let me come to the other issues, Mr. Chidambaram, in the farming sector. This has been called as the 1991 moment in agriculture. Do you think that any of the government's provisions are enough to mitigate what, again, I'll say has been a cascading disaster in the agriculture sector? The moves that they have now spelled out, do you think it's going to turn the clock on it?
The devil is in the detail. I have supported repeal of the APMC Act. I've supported extensive amendments to the EC Act. Of course, there was no consensus. We were running a minority government. We were depending upon the left parties and some regional parties. So we never had an opportunity to push through any amendment. But I think these two laws require a complete overhaul. And let's see what draft amendments they bring. See, the devil is in the detail. Even the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh and other affiliated organizations of RSS are wondering what is this monster that is coming. So let us see the details first.
So, is there need for a radical shift? Seeing this terrible disaster, has some things become clear to you in terms of radical shifts in priorities of the Indian economy? Because this business about not generating jobs predates the pandemic, and that crisis was already there. We had already reached a 40-year high of unemployment, and that was true even in your regime, sir. I remember you shared with me once a very startling data, which was that since 1991, only about 30 million formal jobs had been created. Now that we've seen something that's been such a rupture, do you think you would shift the boat completely? Should India rethink its entire economic approach to creating jobs? If you were the finance minister today, how would you generate jobs?
Well, I'm not. I don't have all the data. So it's very difficult to offer any conclusions. But clearly, my thinking has also been undergoing changes. You see, we had focused on, as you rightly said, formal sector job creation. But we must realize that India must live with more informal sector jobs than formal sector jobs for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 10, 20 years. So we must focus on the informal jobs that are being created. What level of social security and legal protection those workers should have, and how do you bring them into the formal sector? These are matters which I believe, I confess, we have neglected. As far as agriculture is concerned, I think it is still under severe control. Although ownership is private, everything else is dominated by government and bureaucratic intervention. There's an Ashok Gulati article today which welcomes the proposed changes. We have to take a full comprehensive look at what needs to be done to completely free agriculture. Agricultural imports, agricultural exports, agricultural pricing, agricultural costs, all that has to be completely looked at. There are many other things which have to be done, but I've been thinking about it over the last few months.
Yeah, so it's interesting that, when I was talking about this reorientation, even of the vocabulary around these things, I mean, in America, a lot of agriculture is formalized, and yet it is something that the government deeply subsidizes. Moving forward, Ratin Roy, for instance, has been suggesting that even consumption should shift focus to different areas where there's genuine demand, which is shelter, education, food, housing, and health. Do you think that could become booming sectors of consumption?
There are some sectors which have to be always subsidized, even if they are profit-making sectors. But education has to be subsidized. It's subsidized all over the world. Urban transport is always to be subsidized. Likewise, I believe agriculture will always have to be subsidized. That's point one. So keep that in mind. Subsidy is not a bad word, as long as the subsidy has merit subsidy. The second thing is we miss the huge opportunity before India. There are millions of jobs that are crying to be created. We need teachers,
more doctors.
We need doctors, nurses, paramedics. We need a whole lot of sectors that are completely undermanned. We need to train people and populate these sectors with these people so that jobs can be created, and jobs will be created. Supply also creates demand sometimes. See, for example, when I first became an MP, when I went to a village, I would find children with very bad teeth, but nobody went to a dentist. Today, in my small town of Karaikudi, there are half a dozen dentists with a flourishing practice. Everybody from the village comes to the dentist today. Every child comes to the dentist today. Once you give a supply of dentists, there is a demand for dental work. But I think there are huge opportunities, and I've said this before, that we are not creating the jobs which are waiting to be created. And people want those jobs to be created, not only because it gives them jobs, it also gives them a service.
So, the big obsession now is about wooing investments away from China. And again, what would you do to make India a destination for companies that may be fleeing other countries?
Now, this is a big question, requires a more elaborate answer. I believe that if we are an open economy and an open democracy, I think both go hand in hand, an open polity and an open economy, and keep the growth rate close to 7%, investment will flow. And the signal to the world is we will continue to open more, we will continue to integrate our economy with the global economy. But all the signals that I've got from this government since it was re-elected in 2019 and for a little while earlier is that we are afraid of becoming part of the global market. We don't have to do anything extraordinary. All we have to do is keep an open polity, an open economy, and say the law and order and the legal system will take care of all problems. At the moment, the legal system is broken, but that has to be another separate discussion.
So I'll just end with one last question, which is that speaking just for yourself, what has this massive rupture left you with? You know, that if you were to sum up maybe one big shift in thinking, what would it be?
See, the biggest impact it has on my thinking is while we are on the right path, we were looking at only one side of the road. We were not looking at the other side of the road. There is a huge underclass in India, which is poor, insecure, without any social or legal security. So as we travel on this road, we have to look both sides of the road. We have to keep an eye on those who are the early winners. There will be early winners in any opening up. There will also be many losers in an opening up. We have to keep an eye on the losers too. That's the biggest impact this crisis has brought to me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.